Hi class, I hope you're each doing well. Welcome to part 2 of our module on adolescence, where you're going to be learning about cognitive development during this period of time.
We're now going to spend some time looking at cognitive development in adolescence. So after this section, and after having read your book and listened to this review and watched the videos that are on the course website, you should be able to describe Piaget's formal operational stage and the characteristics of formal operational thought. You should also be able to describe what's called adolescent egocentrism. You should be able to describe information processing research on attention and memory. You should also be able to describe the developmental changes in language and describe the various types of adolescent education. And then you should also be able to identify changes in high school dropout rates that are based on gender and ethnicity. During adolescence, we see a heightened level of self-focus. And I think we need to remember as well that there will be cultural variations in terms of the degree to which this is expressed and experienced. So, for example, in the United States, we live in an individualistic culture, one that is very focused on individual goals and individual needs and desires. And so we might see that egocentrism may look different or maybe at a higher level than what we might see in a collectivistic culture where there is more emphasis on community, on group goals, and there is less self-focus. So let's take a look at adolescent egocentrism. And as we do, I'd like for you to keep in mind that there will be cultural variables. And then I think also it's important to note too that in throughout the world, we wouldn't likely only see differences among that are related to cultural variables, but we may also see differences as they relate to gender and gender roles and expectations as well. So During the time of adolescence, there is a heightened self-focus or self-absorption. But unlike preschoolers, as you learned about egocentrism in that stage of development, adolescents know that others have different perspectives on the world. So it's not an inability to understand that or to cognitively grasp that. Instead, adolescents are simply more interested in their own feelings and experiences than anyone else's experiences. And so, in addition, as they search for an identity, which we'll be talking about here in just a short time, many adolescents believe that they are the focus of other people's thinking. And so this then can, for example, lead to a teen who, let's say, spills food on themselves. They may imagine that all their friends are thinking about only the stain on their shirt and how sloppy she is rather than any other element of that person. So many adolescents are feeling that they are, I guess you could say, actors that are being watched constantly by their peers. And this is known as an imaginary audience. So here, adolescents might become much more upset than individuals who are not in this stage when they make obvious mistakes like spilling food or spilling drink, or if they're out shopping with their parents and they think others see them with their parents. Sometimes that might be something someone is focused on. It doesn't have to be something specific, but it is this overall, in general, a belief that those around them are concerned and focused on their appearance as they themselves are. Also, this egocentrism is demonstrated by what's called a personal fable. And this is the tendency to believe that, for the adolescent to believe that their experiences and feelings are unique and that no one else has ever felt that the way that they do or has thought the way that they do. So, for example, it might be like the feelings of first love or the despair of a broken relationship or being confused about planning for the future. Adolescents often believe that they're the first to experience these feelings and that no one else could understand these emotions. I also want to mention something here that's related to what we discussed when we looked at brain development. So if you'll remember, one of the issues related to brain development is that there is an increase in risk taking, but yet the prefrontal cortex is still not fully developed. And so this can lead to very risky, dangerous behaviors. And in addition to this, there's also an increase in the desire for pleasure-seeking outcomes. So here in this stage, something that's related to cognitive development is a feeling of invulnerability, where there's a belief that misfortune, only happens to other people. And so this then might lead teens to think that they could have sex without becoming pregnant because only other people become pregnant, or that they could have unprotected sex and not receive, and not get a sexually transmitted disease because only that happens to others. And so all of this is part of adolescent egocentrism. There are many different consequences of formal operational thought. One, for example, is greater introspection. And you may remember during adolescence having the ability to really think more deeply about your own thoughts and your own feelings. In addition, there is an increased tendency to be idealistic, where there's an insistence on high standards of behavior. And you may reflect on your own adolescence and remember having those sorts of thoughts. And then also there is hypocrisy, where they're more likely to pretend to be what they're not. And then there's also something called pseudo-stupidity. And this is the adolescent's tendency to overlook the obvious and the inability to make appropriate choices. And it results from the lack of experience with newly attained abilities to perceive many possibilities simultaneously. Adolescents typically solve problems more readily than children, as you've read in your textbook. And this is in part because their approach is more sophisticated, as you would imagine. Often children rely on what are called heuristics. And a heuristic is a rule of thumb that doesn't guarantee a solution, but it's useful in solving a range of problems. So heuristics, they tend to be fast and require very little effort. Now, in contrast, adolescents, they are more likely to solve problems analytically, determining, for example, the answer to a problem mathematically or logically, of course, depending on the nature of the problem. So as an example, let's say in trying to decide what type of bicycle they want to buy, more common among children, they might rely on personal experience. So buy the bike that a friend says is best. Whereas the adolescent is going to be more analytical. They're going to rely maybe on statistical information, like they're going to buy the bike that's rated best by a large sample of buyers. I also want to point out too that adolescents are better skilled at finding weaknesses in arguments. You may remember yourself having this ability enhanced during adolescence. And when I say better, I mean better than when you were in childhood. So in logical reasoning, an adolescent can pinpoint flaws in arguments, and in scientific reasoning, they can recognize some of that problems with making generalizations from very small samples. So for example, they would be reluctant to conclude that people from another country are particularly friendly by just meeting two people from that country. So you can see here there's an increase in the ability to to reason. And we're also using here, instead of relying on heuristics, these rules of thumb, there's a greater reliance on statistical information and a greater reliance on using logic to solve a problem. In addition, what you see happening during adolescence is that executive functions are pretty competent during adolescence. And executive functions include the ability to plan, the ability to organize, and also the ability to self-regulate. I want to point out, though, that even though self-regulation has improved, the ability to control impulses may still fail, just as we discussed in the section when we looked at the adolescent brain. What we also see during adolescence is that deductive reasoning emerges, where adolescents are using general principles to propose specific conclusions. And we'll look at the contrast between deductive and inductive here in a moment. And then we see the ability to process information both not only intuitively but analytically. So we have a dual process model of thinking where we have both intuitive thought that's automatic, fast, and emotional, and then the ability to also think deliberately, consciously, and rationally. So on figure 612, there is a comparison between inductive and deductive reasoning. Let's first examine inductive reasoning, which is bottom-up reasoning. So inductive reasoning begins with observations that are specific, and this can include past experiences and ideas from authority. But all of these are more limited in scope than what we're going to be looking at with deductive reasoning. And so it proceeds from these very specific things, these specific and limited in scope observations or past experiences and ideas, and then it proceeds to a general conclusion that is, while likely but not certainly, correct. So you could say that inductive reasoning moves from specific to general. And this is actually how much of scientific research is carried out. When you think about a scientist who's gathering evidence and maybe forming hypotheses, seeking evidence or looking for patterns, and then they develop a theory based on this. So this is inductive reasoning. And then we have deductive reasoning, which we're seeing grow in adolescence and develop. And so this starts with the assertion of a general rule, and then it proceeds from there to a guaranteed specific conclusion. So it's moving from the general rule to a specific application. So in other words, if the original assertions are true, then the conclusion must also be true. So, this is where you might think of, like, just as an example in perhaps a math class that you're taking, if x equals 4 and if y equals 1, then 2x plus y equals 9. And so this is where you're going from a general principle to something that is a guaranteed specific conclusion.
Let's take a moment to reflect and apply what you've learned. So think about the cognitive changes that you've learned happen during adolescence. Why do you think it would be useful to know about these changes? Who do you think might benefit from knowing about these changes? What about teachers? What about health professionals? Many of you are nursing majors or health science majors. Why would it be beneficial for you to know? So would it be useful to be able to know the cognitive capabilities of adolescents so that you're able to have conversations with them about their health and behaviors? What about parents? Think about how useful this information would be for parents in managing the expectations that they have for their kids, in helping them to understand the still ever-present challenges that adolescents can have with impulse control. Although there are dramatic improvements, there are still some challenges. Also, the ability to delay gratification can still be somewhat difficult for adolescents. Now, there is variation from adolescent to adolescent, but understanding these changes can be very helpful for parents. What about marketers? If you're marketing products to adolescents, would knowing about their cognitive abilities be important in terms of the types of information you present, how you present that information? So let's just take a moment to apply what you've learned. Suppose you were an experienced fifth grade teacher who's going to be teaching high school for the first time. What study skills do you think you could expect from your new students that you would not expect in fifth graders? If you're not sure, I'd encourage you to pause this video, maybe go back into your textbook or just scroll through or look at your notes, and you might want to go back through this video and take a look at some of the key points that you've learned. So let's think about this. Well, if it were me, I would expect my new students to have working memory capacity and processing speed that are similar to an adult's. I'd also think about how adolescents are also skilled at gaining expertise in particular content areas, like the use of electronics, and that they're pretty good at identifying strategies that are appropriate for a specific task. So due to the improvements that I know that they're going to have in information processing, I can expect that the new students that I have in high school are going to be able to outline and highlight information in a text. Now, I know that younger kids may do this, but I'm going to expect that adolescents in high school will be able to do this. And they're going to be able to do this because this is going to help them to, or they're going to know about their own knowledge. They're going to know what they need to do to study more effectively. And so they might be able to then at the same time also make lists of material that they should study more, and maybe even to create master study plans. This is going to be very different from what they would have been able to do in fifth grade. So if I'm a teacher, it's going to be important for me to know about cognitive development throughout the lifespan. But in particular, I'm going to want to know about what is typically seen in the age group that I'm teaching.
Another important issue that is related to adolescence is dropping out of high school. And the proportion of youth and young adults that live in the United States who dropped out of high school has significantly declined over the past several decades. And your textbook provides the percentage of 7% overall in 2013. And I think that more recently, the rate is actually at 6%. And I also want to point out that gaps between racial and ethnic groups have decreased over the last decade, but I should still point out that Hispanic youth are still more likely to have dropped out of high school than individuals of other major races and ethnicities. There are some significant individual consequences and then social consequences of adolescents dropping out of high school that I'd like to point out. So what are some of the effects? So individually, we know that students who drop out of high school are 3 times likely to be unemployed than individuals who actually graduate from college. And it's estimated that about 2/3 of all jobs this year in 2020 require some form of education after high school. So it's going to be difficult for individuals who have not graduated from high school to find employment, especially in contrast to those who have finished high school, or especially those who have finished college. Also, students who drop out of high school they actually account for 67% of inmates in state prisons and 56% of federal prisons. And it's not as though dropping out of high school directly causes this, but there are indirect consequences that can increase one's risk for going to prison. And then also among women who drop out of high school, they are more likely to be single mothers. And then individuals who drop out of high school are more likely to use government assistance. So there are these individual consequences, and then there are some significant effects overall to us as a society. And so if, let's say, we could increase the graduation rate by just 5% among males, it's suggested that we could have an $18.5 billion reduction in annual crime costs. Also, think about this. The national spending average to educate a student is just over $12,600, while the cost to house an inmate is $28,000 approximately. Also, if we were to cut the national dropout rate, this would save the US over $7.3 billion in annual Medicaid spending. So these are just some of the potential societal effects of reducing the high school dropout rate. So you might wonder, who is most vulnerable to dropping out of high school? What are some of the reasons? It turns out that the reasons that people drop out of high school are varied, but there seems to be some common reasons. So one that increases one's risk is getting held back a grade. Another is needing to work to support the family. Drug use is another factor. Becoming pregnant, missing too many days of school, having difficulty keeping up in school. The ones of those that seem to be the most significant are about 26% have said that the reason that who did leave school said that the reason that they did was to become a caregiver for a family member. So that's a very high rate of students saying that. And then also 20% said that school wasn't relevant to their lives. So these are just some interesting statistics, and we need to think about as a society, and more specifically as a community, what can we do to increase high school graduation rates? It ultimately benefits individuals and then our community as well.
So, what did you learn about the cognitive changes that happen during adolescence? You learned about Piaget's formal operational stage and the characteristics of formal operational thought. You also learned about adolescent egocentrism, and you learned about information processing research on attention and on memory. You also learned about the developmental changes in language and the different types of adolescent education. Please be sure to go back and take a look at these in your textbook. You also learned about changes in high school dropout rates based on gender and ethnicity. And you had the chance to think about why it's important for us to have an understanding of the cognitive changes that happen during this period of development, and to think about how you might apply your knowledge of these changes in a real world setting like in education. So what will you be learning about next? Well, next you're going to be learning about the changes in self-concept and self-esteem in adolescence. You'll also learn about Erikson's fifth psychosocial task of identity versus role confusion. I've placed on the content page under the instructional videos, I placed a link to a video of Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, and I'd encourage you to watch that. You may have already seen this. I did have it in a previous module, but I put it here again just as a review because I want you to be thinking about how each stage builds on one another. So in other words, how do our earlier stages affect our current development? You're also going to be learning about Marcia's 4 identity statuses that are related to Erikson's stage of psychosocial development that adolescents are in. You'll also be learning about the 3 stages of ethnic identity development and the parent-teen relationship. And then you'll also be learning about the role of peers. As always, if you have any questions about any of the material in your book, in the video, or anything at all that I can help you with in this class, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I look forward to seeing each of you online.